Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Paul. So Paul is the National Commercial Manager at Dulux Group. Paul, can I ask how long you've been employed by Dulux? This is a record.
A very long time. I'll let us say that. I think this will be year 38, without saying too much.
Does anybody in the audience know somebody that's been employed by their workplace for 38 years? No, I didn't think that would be the case.
It doesn't mean how old I am either. I'll show my age.
I wanted any maths there. Oh, and I get more people coming into the room as we're speaking. Anna, who works in our Queensland office, has said that she knows somebody that's been employed by their workplace for 38 years. Okay, there's a couple of others. So that's pretty interesting there, and it's a rare thing. So it says a lot about your level of knowledge, but also your engagement with Dulux Group and also the organisation, which I think is something that you should be proud of. And now I'm going to tell everybody in the audience a little bit about Paul. As we know, Paul has been working with Dulux for a very long time. The majority of his career has been with Dulux in the AcraTex coating business. He's been overseeing new business development across Asia, New Zealand, China, Southeast Asia, focusing on high build facade coatings for both medial and new construction markets. Paul has been involved in providing facade coating solutions for both traditional building substrates and today's growing demand of emerging panelised substrates for fast-track construction in multi-residential, commercial and the infrastructure segments. So if you could all join me in putting some extra clappy hands or waves into the box to welcome Paul. He will now screen share and start his presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. That leaves some big shoes to fill now. So I hope everyone's going to enjoy this over the next half hour and 45 minutes. So what we're going to cover off today is this, the topic's quite popular at the moment within the industry around non-combustibility and compliance, but it's understanding non-combustibility and really what's fit for purpose at the same time and how do we bring those two criteria together. We'll cover that, how weatherproofing really plays a part of this and long-term durability as well too when you sort of look at the overall scheme of things. Also this interpretation of what a render is versus what a texture coating is. So we'll cover all of that within the NCC in its interpretation. And then what we'll do is we'll finish off with our sort of recommendation of what the coating systems look like in relation to the surface that you're going to apply to, and then how those comply, in our opinion, back to the NCC, into the NCC, how to interpret it. As we all know, the NCC is open for interpretation. It's very vague. It really gets down to sometimes individuals on how they want to interpret a certain part of the NCC. So, as we know, the building, the NCC is written up in two volumes. Volume 1, Volume 2. What we're going to focus on in this presentation is really Class 2 to Class 9 buildings around the apartments and offices, etc., where all this non-combustibility criteria has come into play over the last 6-12 months, and it's sort of accelerated. Started off in New South Wales, it's really now accelerated into Victoria, and we've seen it really in the last 3 to 6 months also accelerating in WA in that criteria there, and how surveyors have really had to learn where in the past surveyors have really not worried about coatings or renders in general. It's now come from non-existence to number one almost on every job in this particular class type building of construction. We'll cover off how then weatherproofing plays a part of this, but also on how that and the non-combustible element fits into play. But more importantly, it's all this fit for purpose. It's really bringing the whole thing together on how the three are really important to each other, but importantly, how long-term all these coatings are going to perform over the various substrates for these top class buildings. So what does a pathway look like? And this is what we have learnt in the marketplace, talking to the various industry bodies, including the building certifiers who have actually got, they've got the hard job of actually trying to make play of all this and interpret the building code and at the same time allow the projects to continue to go forward as well too. So what we've got in the middle is obviously our compliance rule book, which is the NCC. around what they think is non-combustibility, the weatherproofing requirements, and then durability within that NCC volume 1 construction, for class 2, class 9 buildings. And we actually split this into 2 halves. So if we took the left-hand side to start with, within the NCC, what we've got is there's a definition in there under render, and there's various definitions under render in there as well too. They've also got a definition there for texture. But where that texture definition sits really is within the Australian standards, but more importantly, it actually only comes out of the construction dictionary. And what we've learnt in this is that a lot of the surveyors sort of don't use the construction dictionary, or not a lot of industry bodies actually use that dictionary for interpretation or terminologies of descriptions of particular items when they're not listed within the actual NCC themselves. And it's how do you actually bring all that together, allow it, to try and work your way through this pathway with it. And both texture and render are actually listed in those dictionaries, which are very, very clearly defined on how you can actually interpret that. So that's looking at it on the NCC's point of view. If you then look at it from a coatings point of view or a manufacturer's point of view, and even from your point of view, a project criteria point of view, the things that you need to consider before into that decision is firstly, obviously, the building type, but then more importantly is the substrate, what you're going to actually build the building out of, what the cladding system is going to consist of, and what the facade layers are. And then is the coating element an attachment, or is it purely there as a decorative coating as well? The compatibility, so ensure that the products, the finish that you're trying to achieve, the aesthetic finish that you're going to achieve is compatible with the material, with the substrate you're going to put it over. And then how many layers are involved to achieve that look and finish? And then what's the overall sort of thickness? And we've put that into play like this way is because what surveyors continually come back to us and asking us is those questions all the time. How many layers are involved? How thick is each of those particular layers to achieve the final look? And what's drawn under that is obviously then test data to demonstrate compliance of the system. That brings it back in together again, and then it takes you either a path of deemed to satisfy path or a performance solution. And what we have learned is that people, across the whole industry, really, all professions, they're reluctant to go down a performance solution path unless that's the ultimate last option to get a building permit on the project. Everyone's still trying to work down the deemed to satisfy path. And I think what we're going to present today has got a path to demonstrate that path through it. It's just how we actually then present all this to the surveyor, which is very, very critical. So if we start off with the interpretation around render, and I'll use that word very, very loosely as well too, because I think where render sits today in everyone's definition is completely different where it's at 10, 20, 30 or 40, 50 years ago within industry as well too. So if you look, and I've set this up as 2 parts. So part 1 is how it's defined within the building code, or what we use as the construction dictionary under the HB50 classification, which basically is pretty straightforward, as we all know what render is. It's, it's a site, it can either be a site mix, sand, cement. We add some lime, some additional additives in there to apply onto an external wall finish. And that's generally the way render's been used for the last 100 years, mixed on site the way it's going. In July 2020, because of some of the, I suppose, not the confusion, but people not understanding where render fitted into the whole category, the ABCB let out a communication piece to the industry relating to render. And they basically were talking about, that all renders need to be non-combustible and there will be no concession under 1.9, which is all relevant. However, what that article didn't go on to say is how is that then come into play as a total system when they're only defining one one layer of a total coding system. And we'll get through this as we talk, but the article still sits there today. If you look at part 2 of what renders are, which is what render is about today, render is no longer mixed on site, unless, there are sort of exceptions to the rule, but 99% of the stuff that we see used today, render is applied, comes in a bag. And that cement render that you buy in a bag is no different to what's really used on, mixed on site over the last 100 years. It's still made up of sand, cement and lime. What's different about it though, is you've got a controlled environment, how it's manufactured and formulated, but you've got polymer additives or resins, which really are the key criteria of helping the render stay together over a longer period of time, from adhesion to what you're going to apply it over the top, which is no difference really what they did on site. They used to put plasticizers in it to bring that together. Now what we do is we've got these polymer and resins that basically bring all that together. So any cementitious or polymer render that you see in the marketplace have all got 90% of them are all formulated very, very similar, but it's a polymer resin content that is a critical part to the system. We then go so that's the general perception of what a render looks like. What happens then is what's been happening is that everyone's being asked for a 1530 part 1 for render. And really what they're asking is the render, the only part that you can actually test is a solid mass material to be able to test to that criteria, the way the criteria is set up. And we'll talk a bit about more of that criteria later on. But primarily is that these renders in a bag that will pass the 1530 part 1 are very, very low in polymer content that are only really suitable for traditional stable masonry substrates. And we're really only talking brick and block work, precast and off-form concrete, and that's probably where you draw the line, where a non-combustible render that's provided in a bag with low polymer content is only suitable for use. What happens when you put these low polymer renders onto a substrate that's not traditional? What will happen over time is they can go drummy and basically crack and allow them to fall off the wall. And we've seen that over the decades. That happens continually all the time as well. The other point to know is that the NCC hasn't, in the 219 version, has never defined what a thickness of a render material can be or can't be, nor a non-combustible render in that respect can be or can't be as well. So if we look at then this perception of what render is, so if we took render what we think it is, what the building code tells us it is, it's sand, cement and lime with polymers and additives into it, which is consistent what it used to be and what it is today when you see it coming out of the bag. Unfortunately, what's happened is the market's changed so much that the perception now of render is this aesthetic look that I achieve, that I've got on the wall. And what's being missed in the whole interpretation is how to achieve that look is done in various ways. And that's the critical part to this path here, is that to achieve that look that everyone perceives as a render, it's generally about a three-layer system. A being the base coat, that's generally the levels off the surface, which can be 2 to 4, 6 mil, depending on what surface you're putting it over. You've got the texture coat, which is under 1 millimeter thick, and that's really what gives you the aesthetic look, which everyone refers to this render look, because that's the part that actually looks like render. And then you've got a protective layer coat for weatherproofing purposes and keeping the surface clean and maintenance free that sits over the top of that. The base coat is the critical part that is important here, because the base coats vary in 2 types. There's a cementitious material that's used for those surfaces, as I said, block work, AAC, and precast and off-form concrete. And they're the materials, those cementitious ones, the materials, they're the ones that are only deemed as non-combustible, that have been tested and passed AS 1530 Part 1 and are only suitable for those materials. Type 2 of a base coat is what we call a pre-mixed material. So this is more of an acrylic material, ready for use. They're only suitable for the more non-traditional materials like fibre cement sheet or similar to those type of materials there. And those materials can't be tested to 1530 Part 1. So it takes it down a different path of where those materials actually sit as a definition through that path as well too. So, which leads us into this textured paint now interpretation. So we've covered off what the render definition is under the NCC, and then what a perception of a render really is and how it sort of comes together. This is the most critical part, because understanding a paint texture layer is what really gives you the final aesthetics part of it, and is that middle layer. So if we start off with paint as defined within the building code, it basically is a product made of acrylic polymer and resins as the prime raw materials. And 100% of paint products on the market are basically around those type of formulations in the thing. And we also know under the NCC, under C1.14, Part 1, Part I, is that paint is exempt within the building code. So we know that paint's made out of a polymer and resins, and those polymer resins are no different to what are used in other sorts of similar materials. And we also know that paint's exempt. If we then take that one next step, is what is a textured paint? So the textured paint being defined what gives us that textured look. So as defined within the building code or the construction dictionary, this is the underlining part of it. Here is a textured paint is commonly not a flat finish, is there to provide the final aesthetic layer to give you that look that you're looking for. And again, when the ABC released that note back in July last year, they referred to that aesthetic look as the textured paint, therefore making it an exempt or an auxiliary item under C1.14 as well. And that textured paint is where we're starting to get ourselves misinterpreted between what that look is versus asking for a 1530 part 1, which is the simple way out of it, this sort of thing. But it's really trying to understand the various layers that achieve this render look with it. It also in that HB50 classification under texture paint definition, there is no mention or requirement relating to thickness. It basically states that a textured paint can be put on with a roller, a brush, or a trowel to create a variety of finishes with no thickness requirement at all. So under that, ruling, then that sits into your C1.14, and again, and this particular layer, if we call it a layer, is generally applied between 0.2 of a millimetre, it can almost go up to 3-4 millimetres, depending on the composition of the product and depending on what its fit for purpose are. But the core part of it, and they are all the same when you look at a textured paint versus a normal conventional paint. They have all the same type of polymer compositions within them. So if we then take the next step, so if you look at paint versus now a paint texture as defined, so we know that paint's got a polymer resin, a paint texture, which can be put on with a roller to give you a fine medium texture, or a paint texture put on with a trowel, are all sharing the same polymer type of technology across the three technology bases. What differentiates the whole three is the actual aggregate or the particles that give you that final aesthetic look that everyone's now seen in the marketplace as being the render look. So if you look at paint being the one on the left, it provides a flat finish as we know today, and that's generally put on up to about 0.05 millimeters, so very thin layer. If you take the next layer up, which is a paint texture put on with a roller, so these are now got fine sand particles in them to give you a slight sand sort of finish. These are put on around about 0.2, 0.5 millimetre, and they can be easily put on with a roller. It's when then you get into these more coarser finishes, where you've got coarser sand particles that cannot be put on with a roller, you need a trowel applied material because of the aggregate size to create the thickness and the finish that you need. These materials are generally applied anything 0.8, 0.5 to 0.8 of a millimetre, even over 1 millimetre. So we're talking that all up around 1,000 microns in paint language, or down under. But I suppose the underlying factor here is that all these sit on the same polymer resin, and when we know that paint becomes an exempt under the auxiliary item under that C1.4, in our interpretation of this is then paint texture, whether it's a roller applied or trowel applied, fall under the same definition in that relation there through their composition. So what the challenge is really to get everybody, the challenge has been to understand is that the textured paint, which is perceived as render, that's where the big challenge has been, is because everyone's, the surveyors see this perception of, I've got to look, it's render. So it's got to comply to 1530 part 1. So that's one of the challenges that we've had. And it's been then through the last 6-12 months, what we've done is broken this into layers so that we've got a three-layered system to deliver both the aesthetics elements and then how to deliver the fit for purpose elements that works around the NCC compliance. So if you took layer 1 being the base coat that we've spoken about, depending on the substrate, being masonry, all your masonry substrates, including AAC, that's where you can use a 1530 part 1 render, which is a cementitious material. Whereas if I take, which is a type 1, if you took the type 2, being more of the high polymer pre-mixed materials, these are only deemed, which we believe are deemed as a textured paint based on the interpretations that the rule book allows you to work with. are suitable for all your fibre cement sheet systems that are on the marketplace with it. You would not use a type 1 cementitious material over fibre cement sheet, but you could do the other way around because of the way technology. Layer 2 then becomes the aesthetic layer, which is what everybody's really wanting, is the aesthetic finish. And again, same compositions. These are all textured paints that can be applied in different finishes. And then layer 3 becomes the protective paint membrane system, really, which provides the weatherproofing, provides the longer term performance in relation to the aesthetics and keeping the building looking longer as well too. And when you actually bring in AAC, if you're going to use AAC on a job, also that when you bring the three together, there's also an Australian standards, which is 5146, that it's got to comply to. So if you're using AAC on a project, the 5146 is also critical to meet, and under this scenario, you would actually comply to that. So having an NCC compliance, then satisfied path, and the standard is actually breaking. The other way this is done is, in our opinion, is that you can break it down by layer and demonstrate how each layer then complies to each part, into that path to take you down this deemed to satisfied path. The last path, protection layer, that layer number 3, the other critical part of that is, and we've learnt this here in Victoria through the CSV requirements, where they're doing some water runoff tests in relation to weatherproofing on how much water is actually absorbed onto the surface post completion on the job site before the surveyors are actually signing off. And that standard there that's been put up by the CSV, that's very easily done on site and very easily to be observed on site, because where you don't have that protective layer on site, basically what happens is that texture layer will absorb the water in, or the moisture in, whereas with that layer over the top, the water will just basically run off it like it runs off your car, like it'll just basically water bead off. So, excuse me, if we then now look at if we then now take it into what a specification primarily looks like by substrate. So if we look at Hebel AAC, for example, stepped over a 3-layer system, you've got layer 1 being the base coat material, which is generally what we call a pre-packed render. And in this area here, we've gone through and had a product tested that complies to 1530 part 1, which incorporates the mesh, because one of the requirements for AAC is that you need to have a reinforced alkaline mesh within to cover your joints, to take movement over the joints. So that first layer, render, mesh combined together, complies to 1530 part 1. The next layer, being the aesthetic layer, being the textured layer, that's where your variations come into play in relation to the aesthetic finishes, applied either by roll or by trowel. They would fall under the C1.14, in our opinion, being a textured paint and the auxiliary item. More importantly, what we've also done is that we've tested both paint materials and textured paint materials to 1530 part 3, which is generally the rule of thumb for building products, to determine their ignitability and smoke, and they all fall within the same test results when you look at the test data 1530 part 3 as a guide. And then obviously the last one is that paint membrane, which is that important part of the layer, which is actually Group 1 product. So that adds that little level of more comfort to the whole thing. That complies with Group 1. So when you put the 3 layers together as a system, which is the way we're generally representing these, it does 2 things in our opinion. You've got a deemed to satisfy solution based on how each of the layers can comply, and B, it'll comply to 5146 in relation to weatherproofing and crack bridging, as well too when you're using this. And primarily, this is what we're looking at here. So if you look at the left-hand side, is typically what a 3-coat system would look like over ASC with the mesh embodied into it. As I said, the previous slide, the non-combustible render with the mesh has been tested as one system that complies to 1530 part 1. Or on the right-hand side, where we've got a roll-on texture that also can comply as well too. So it gets down to the aesthetic finishes of what's really needed for the actual individual project. But both those systems are both a deemed to satisfy path solution and would comply. And this is the way we've been presenting them to the surveyors and having, reasonable success. The next one is fibre cement sheet, and this has probably been more of the challenging one. The recessed edge, so there's two types of fibre cement sheet, and there's a recessed or an express jointed one. So if you look at the recessed edge one, which is more been commonly used, there's a jointed compound that goes to the joint first. That, in our view, is a paint texture, and that's required with a mesh in it again for the joint elements. You've got a levelling coat that's generally applied to 2 to 3 millimetres, which is premix as well. And again, that layer is a paint texture, and so is then the finishing texture coat, which gives you your aesthetic part of it as well too. And again, all these materials, when you look at their composition materials, fall under that definition of a paint texture under the HB50 classification within the construction industry, which is put on either by roller, trailer, or trout to provide these different finishes. But again, there's no requirements in that criteria where it talks about thicknesses. And this particular system, when combined together over fibre cement sheet, you're generally looking at about a 3 millimetre layer that'll sit over the total surface in that particular area there. So this is what we're looking at in summary. A typical reinforced fibre cement sheet system. You've got the joint system there, which has got the fiberglass reinforced with mesh. You've got a levelling skin coat, around 2 millimetres, and then you've got the textured layer coat for aesthetics. And then you've got that protective layer coat that sits over the top. And if it's then interpreted the right way, it all you've got a fit for purpose system. You've got a DTS solution with a warranty system, and it will be an exempt under C1.14, in our opinion. The last one is the express jointed system, and this has probably got the most flexibility of all the substrates that are on the market at the moment, where I've got options of using a roll-on texture or a trail-on texture, depending on what you're trying to achieve with this. But if you look at the system in its entirety, you've got a layer one, which is basically a primer undercoat. So that's an example being the paint under 1.14. You've got a roll-on texture to give you the aesthetic requirements. Again, the various finishes of different thicknesses. And then the last thing of it is you've got that protective layer top coat, again, that will give you the weatherproofing to the total system for maintenance purposes over long term as well. And primarily, this is what we're looking at when you're looking at express jointed systems, and being used a lot. How if you look at Victoria, what's happening with the CSV projects, there's been a combination of this and the AAC being used on all these projects, and generally this is the way they're all being presented on how to demonstrate a pathway to compliance that's being considered by the surveyors in this particular area here. And then lastly, this is the actual 1530 Part 1 test for those who may or may not be aware of it, sort of thing. So it's quite a severe test. You've got to basically get something to be non-combustible to pass at 750 degrees at 30 minutes. And to be able to do that, you've got to be able to have 6 specimens that are all formed, that 50 millimetre high. It's about a 40 millimetre diameter in circumference. And basically, those get dropped into the burner, and basically for 30 minutes. And basically, as soon as any flame ignitability that comes in within a certain part of that test, it's basically deemed as a fail. So it's really, really severe test to actually pass. You can't. This is where we've been trying to get, I suppose, the explanations come into play, where when people think of a render as just this look, then that's where you've got to break this thing down the layers. So the only part of the layers that we can actually test a 1530 Part 1 within the industry is that base layer that is a cement-based material that is very, very low polymer content. With that, you can't actually test a wet texture paint or a paint for that matter words, because A, you can't form a test specimen similar to what you can see there on screen, and B, if you did, it'll still fail because polymer is the combustible element of those paints or paint texture. And people get surprised when we say the paint's actually combustible, but it is because it's got polymer in it. And so therefore paint textures are also combustible. So in summary, it is really taking into consideration compliance, which is absolutely number one. We totally, that's obviously got to comply with the NCC. Then balancing that up with fit for purpose systems that are warrantable, that are going to be here long term, that everyone can walk away for 10 years. And let's not forget that what we've presented here today has been used within the industry of the same substrates for the last 20, 30 years, 40 years even. Nothing's really has changed. What's changed is because we've had all these ACP fires that have occurred, unfortunately what's happened is that the rules that are applied now for ACPs have been adopted over to coating systems or other coating systems with other cladding substrates underneath as well too. So the challenge has really been is breaking this into layers and defining which layer of these can be non-combustible, and then which of these layers that deliver the aesthetic parts, but also can be defined under other various interpretation of the NCC that gives us those exempt rules, allow us to apply those exempt rules within what the rules allow you to apply. Alexia, that's it for me. How are we going for time? I suppose I'll hand it back to you now to, I suppose, have a look at what questions we've got.
Great, thank you. Paul, if we could take down the slide, brilliant. I'm going to turn my video back on.
Okay.
First question has been asked a couple of times is about the slides. We've replied in the chat, yes, they will be emailed out. Paul has kindly provided us with a copy of them to already send. So you will receive a copy of them in your follow-up, everyone who is on the call. Also, we have agreed to putting the content. Thank you for that, Luciana. Or Lucinda, sorry. Apologies about that. The screen moved quickly. We will also be putting the talk onto YouTube. So just give us a little bit of time, a couple of days to download the video, convert it and add it onto the YouTube channel. Maybe go back late next week and you'll see it up there. You are receiving lots of thank yous and comments. It's a great talk. So thank you so much for that, Paul. Now, I'm going to go back, everybody, just so you know, I'm going back to the start of the questions. You feel free to keep adding in your comments, but I'm going back to the start to go through them one at a time. If Paul doesn't have the answer to all of your questions, we will take them on notice, but I'm sure that will be fine. So, where in the NCC is render and texture defined, Paul?
Okay, as I said through the presentation, good question. Render and texture are defined within the construction dictionary under HB50 classification.
Great.
And in the presentations there, the links are actually there to take them straight to the definitions within that. And the construction dictionary is allowed to be used interpretation to the NCC when there's no defined definition within the actual volume of the NCC.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. And I really appreciate that you've already pre-hyperlinked everything. I think everyone in the audience will as well. That's great. Okay, and that question was from Adrian. So thank you, Adrian, for that. The next question is from Phil Rogers. So Phil would like to know, what about PVC substrate applications? Phil, are you able to... I'm assuming your meaning are these changes relevant to PVC substrate applications? Paul, is that how you're interpreting this?
Yeah, I think I know how I'm interpreting this. There's a loss form substrate out there, what we call loss form concrete substrate. It's got a PVC face. And if I take the non-combustibility debate away from this for a minute, there are systems out there that can be used of a loss form PVC. However, what's happened is that the non-combustibility criteria is making it really, really challenging to get them to work over that particular substrate. But if you break it down into using the definitions allowed within the construction dictionary, using just purely paint elements and paint texture products, then there could be a solution for PVC. It's how the surveyor then interprets that is the challenge.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. So, Phil, thank you for the question. And Frank, we've addressed your question about the slides. There was another question from Adrian Tarrant. So Adrian, I'm going to hope that you have put that question back into the chat box. Have a look and check whether it's in there. If you could do that while I move on through the other questions. Now, somebody whose username is NW is asking about the slides again. We've covered that off. And we now have Catherine O. Are there samples available for the finishes? Look at that. Nice.
That's an easy question. The answer is yes, there are. Dulux, through the Dulux website, the Specify website, there's an online ordering tool in there that people can order their texture samples. I'll use that word, texture samples, because they're not render samples. Yeah, but that can be done online.
There we go. Thank you for that. There's a comment from Ahmed Fari saying great talk. Thank you so much. That's very nice of you, Ahmed.
Yeah.
Now, question from Scott McMahon. In the upcoming 2022 draft, paint is no longer an ancillary item. It will be moved to non-combustible element with total system thickness of 2 millimeter. How will this comply still?
So, good question, and we've read that. I'll answer it this way. We, as Dulux, have actually put in a proposal for change to that specific clause, and we've submitted that a couple of weeks ago. All I can say is watch this space, and the way the submission's actually gone in is to actually cover off some of the things that we're talking about and take some of the interpretation away to make it a little bit more defined. So, and I'm happy to have that discussion offline if anyone wants my number to discuss that further as well.
Great. What we'll do is, with Paul's approval, we will provide his contact details and email address for him. Is he all right with that, Paul?
Yeah, no problems at all.
And then that way everybody can get back in touch, because it's always good to be able to connect following these sessions. Next question is from PX. PX, thank you for your question. How about the substrates such as Rytec and AFS Logic Wall?
Logic Wall, yeah.
Did I pronounce that correctly, Paul?
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, that's this lost form concrete. So we had a PVC question. Now we've got a fibre cement sheet question.
Right.
In that element there. And it's basically a similar answer. If I go down the path, which we have actually covered off in the presentation, so if you look at the recessed edge slide, which talks about the various layers over recessed fibre cement sheet, which is what Logic Wall is, that would be our path. That's our first go-to pathway to demonstrate, compliance and deemed to satisfy a path over fibre cement sheet using the paint texture terminology and rule book within the NCC. And again, using non-combustible render, I'll use that word again, non-combustible render over those substrates, being cementitious, is generally we've kept away from because of their low polymer content, and we know will fail due to that reason, and a number of other reasons as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of other comments.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they're compliments. Paul, you're getting a lot of compliments. Michael, good talk. Thank you. Chris Young, thanks for a very clear presentation. Peter Woolard, thanks, Paul. How does the info discuss differ for a residential home? Thanks for that question, Peter.
So can you repeat that, please, Alexia? How?
So the question is from Peter Woolard, and it says, how does the info discuss differ for a residential home?
Oh, that's easy. For residential class 1 buildings, non-combustibility is not relevant. It doesn't work. So all these systems that we've presented will work in residential housing because that clause is not required for class 1.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it, Paul. Frank Sipoli said thank you. Robert Dodgson has said thank you. Dominic has said thanks, Paul. How can we get a copy? We are going to be sending that out. Another question about CPD. You might have missed this. Jacopo, That's an interesting name, Baldini. Apologies if the pronunciation is a little bit incorrect there. There is no certificate for this. This isn't formal CPD. This is informal CPD. There is a big process that is attributed to formal CPD, which is what makes formal CPD so important. So this is a regular presentation for the sake of your day-to-day, the formal CPD presentation. Now we have a question from PX again. Thank you, PX. Systems on RITEC and AFS logic wall, which could meet requirements for AS 1530.1. That's exactly how it's worded, Paul.
I'll go back to the same answer that the go-to systems over fibre cement sheets is a paint texture system on how we would interpret it for compliance, you know, and also for fit for purpose and warranty. A 1530 Part 1 base layer, yes, can be applied. However, it's short-term, not long-term, so it would be challenged whether it's actually fit for purpose. And we've got lots of experiences with using similar materials to 1530 Part 1 renders. Over fibre cement sheet, we know that that do delaminate and fail quite quickly because of their low polymer. So the trick to adhesion to fibre cement sheet with those particular substrate is the polymer. 1530 Part 1 renders a very, very, very low polymer content and a very low formula and have very low adhesion capacity. That's therefore result in cracking, delaminating very quickly as movement occurs through thermal stress. You add a dark color to that, you'll accelerate it even further. Thank
you, Paul. Okay, we have 3 thank yous to Paul from Phil Rogers. Phil, I like that dedication. Thank you. Okay, the next question is from NW. Assuming application over GFRC is no different to Hebel or similar substrates. Thank you for your question, NW.
So GRC is different again. You couldn't use the Hebel system over GRC. In fact, you treat GRC down a similar path as PVC with a paint-related paint texture pathway in a multiple layer paint using those type of technologies, whereas 1530 Part 1 will not work over GRC.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, the next question is from S. Kelly. Great presentation, Paul. May I ask if the Dulux Render P400 is tested for non-combustible?
Yes, that was one of the very first products we tested, and unfortunately it did not pass 1530 Part 1 due to the polymer content. Without giving too much away, what we do know that the ones that have passed 1530 Part 1 across the board, not just ours, have got under 0.5% of polymer, which is really, really low content. So what's really passing that test is sand, cement, lime, and water. That's it. That little bit of polymer is just enough to hold it together, which is not suitable for a lot of substrates, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question we have is from Paola S. Can you apply the textured paint onto MDF?
Onto
MDF.
Yeah, you can. You can apply textured paint over MDF with the right primer, of course. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Chanran Chen has a question. Would Dulux also offer certain waterproofing ability for bathroom, kitchen, for areas that are not tiled? So that's a general areas within those spaces that are not tiled. Yeah. Same for external areas that might face sea breeze and rain.
So through under our Fosrock product range, there's a number of waterproofing membranes and materials that are suitable for that particular application without a problem at all. And happy to take that offline if need be as well.
Great, thank you. So then a lot of thank yous. Now we have a question from Andrew Caldwell. Do you have a fire hazard properties group 1, 2, or 3 classification for internal use of textured code? Does it not apply because it is not aligning?
So let me just rephrase that question. Is that question referring to internal paints? Is the question?
Internal use of a textured coat.
Okay. So the textured paint that we've got, we have got testing to 1530 part 3, which are all your fire indices materials on most of those. And they have been used internally in the past as well too. That's probably the best answer I can give him, is that they do have all 1530 part 3s against them.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question, we're hearing from PX again, thank you. Has Dulux AcraTex done a lab test for compatibility of any of the waterproofing products, which would be compatible with your system and still meet requirement for AS 1530.1?
I'll go back to the original way 1530 part 1's test. 1530 part 1 is really only, if you look at the standard, you're only allowed to test one individual product. The criteria doesn't allow us to test multiple products rolled into one as a system, because that's the way the standard is written up. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means if you do it and you got lucky, you passed, then it depends on how the testing laboratory is prepared to hand over that certificate in that relation there, because the rule book says that it's got to be a single element, a single product on its own, so you can't technically test the system with it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Frank Sipoli has asked a question. My understanding is that if you apply 2 coats of AcraShield over texture in Class 1 buildings, it will increase the warranty of the product by 15 years in lieu of 10. It's interesting.
Yeah, that is correct. So if you put 2 coats of AcraShield over the right, as a full Dulux AcraTex system, done correctly, they'll qualify for 15-year warranty.
That's very interesting. Thank you for the answer. And Frank, thank you for the question. That's great. Okay, and we are close to the end of the questions, which is great because we are getting close to the end of the session. Is AcraShield a waterproof coating? And this is a question from Phil Rogers.
Okay, good question. We get asked this all the time. I think there's 2 parts of the question, 2 parts of the answer. First is the definition of waterproof. So if you're actually going to define a product as waterproof, you've actually got to test it to the right standard, number 1. So we don't use that word waterproof in a facade coating unless it's actually been tested to that standard. I'll flip it the other way around. We can claim it as a weatherproof facade coating because of the testing that we've got against it under AS 4548, which talks about water transmission and wind-driven rain. And we've got that test data available to demonstrate that it actually is almost as good as waterproofing, but we don't use it under that for that specific reason. Great,
thank you very much for that. Now we have some questions that are snuck into the Q&A box, and I don't want to miss them. Holger Fred has asked a question. Our issues are whether the insurers are on board. We cannot get insurance for some facade systems we detail. Builders will not install them as well. I guess these are common issues, I would assume. Have Dulux talked to the insurance companies?
This has come up. Yeah, it's come up before. Have we spoken to the Insurance Council of Australia? The answer is no, we haven't, but we have gone to a couple of presentations. And unfortunately, they're in a world of their own. We can't influence a lot. That group is very uninfluential. And a lot of the stuff that we're seeing from surveyors is driven around their PI insurance. No different to any other profession on the market at the moment is driven by PI insurance. Of what's in it's like any policy. It's what's in your policy, what's out of your policy. And my simple rule when people ask us about insurance or anything, some insurance companies will insure a P-plate driver and some insurance companies won't insure P-plate drivers. So what we suggest is everyone's got to shop around and what's good for them. But unfortunately, the answer is no. It's that's completely out of our hands.
It's a difficult thing. Yeah. I think everyone should think of the insurers as similar to the way you see economists behave. They have so insurers and economists probably sit on some of the most interesting data pools in the world. They see the way whole markets behave and interact, and that's how they make their bets. So when you see a response coming from an insurer or comment about finding it difficult to influence would be very accurate, I would assume. Doesn't mean that it's completely incapable, but Dulux are not lobbyists, so there's some challenges there.
Putting it, yes.
But it is, they do sit on a lot of data pool and have a bird's eye view, and that's what is informing their decisions. So while on a day-to-day basis there's some difficulty, keep those conversations going with your insurer and with the institute where required, but that's how they're informing decisions. So, so that's something to keep in mind. Another question from Holger is, with the express joint facade system, what type of backing to open joint assembly have been tested, and what do we specify?
So in an express FC system, that jointing system, the weatherproofing belongs to the substrate supplier, not the coating supplier, because the coating is not there to provide the weatherproof seal. The actual, the express sheet jointed has to be able to stand alone on those joints without a coating system over the top. The coating system on those is really, it is aesthetics, but also to stop, water transmission through the front of the sheet and not at the joint. The two, obviously with James Hardy, they've got a lot of these, and they've got all code mark compliance systems on that express sheet jointed, and that weatherproofing, to my knowledge, actually falls under that category as well. So my suggestion, my advice to that would be, great question, is always refer back to the code mark to determine whether that system has been tested to the NCC weatherproofing FP 1.2, whatever that part of it is as well.
Thank you. And Paul, I have to say thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. We have 3 minutes left, and it's very clear that everyone has enjoyed themselves today. We've had a lot of engagement, a lot of questions, so it's a brilliant presentation. I would like to have the parting shot and ask the final question, if that's okay. Paul, what keeps you at Dulux? Your tenure is, as we mentioned before, quite unique and special, so there must be something that's holding you in your role and with the company, and I think it would be interesting to hear.
No one's ever asked me that question before. Hard question. No, easy question to answer. Two parts to that answer. One is the culture that we work within of the company, and it's got history to show that. And then two is really, the industry and, the job role and the industry linked together that allows you to enjoy what you do and the passion for it within the building industry, I suppose. Those two brings together. And the culture part is really allows you to move around within the organisation, the opportunities that actually opens up for you within, if that's sort of an answer.
It is. It shines in the presentation today. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who joined us in the session. Great audience, great turnout. Hope all of you are okay. I understand things have changed very quickly all around Australia and people in very different circumstances. So take care of yourselves and each other. And next week we have another lean in, which we have organised, someone coming all the way from, signing in all the way from America. And this person works for an organisation called Boston Dynamics. Boston Dynamics are a global leader in robotics on site. I would highly recommend that people sign in. I will be sending you Paul's contact details in his presentation, and we will be uploading this onto YouTube. So please join me in putting the hands into the chat box again to thank Paul, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Alexia. Appreciate it.